Welcome to Habitat Live. Since the pandemic began, New York State and the federal government have offered relief programs, from PPP loans to mortgage forbearance to cash payments. But co-op condo corporations and apartment building owners have been excluded from these programs. And as the reality of a closed city continues, the impact on these communities grows. Your organizations have joined forces and demanded that the city freeze property taxes. Frank, could you start out by giving us the details of your demand?
Well, yeah, I can. Let me just start out by laying out two underlying premises, which maybe some of the viewers aren't aware of. But at least in New York City, if you own or manage property, your ability to do that is based on your cash flow, not the value of the building, not the value of the co-op or condo. It's based on the amount of income you take in on a monthly, weekly, yearly basis and what goes out. Secondly, the other underlying premise is almost every building in the city, doesn't matter what it is, operates on a relatively thin margin. So in other words, especially owners of rent-regulated buildings, which we primarily represent, but a lot of co-ops and condos also never have the ability to build up the cash reserves that they might need in the case of an emergency. So now we are in the midst of an emergency, and owners and managers, whether it's a co-op or condo or a rental building, and especially buildings that have commercial space in them, and those buildings are dependent on that commercial income on a monthly basis to meet their bills every month, they're in trouble because of the thin margins and because of the cash flow and because of the crisis that the city's in. So what we've banded together, and we actually, I shouldn't even say we banded together, because MaryAnn and Jay and I work together on a lot of issues, whether it's energy conservation or property taxes or building maintenance. I mean, MaryAnn and I go back, I don't want to say 35 years doing this, at least, and Jay to a lesser extent, but that all the organizations have always worked closely together on all these issues. So as you just correctly pointed out, there's been no economic relief provided by government at any level to people who own and operate buildings in New York City, and for that matter, across the country. And the one thing that government can control is the assessment on a building, as well as the tax rate, which is, it's always the tax rate multiplied times the assessment that tells you what your taxes are twice a year or 4 times a year, depending on the size of your building. So we have asked the city to say, look, there's no relief for us. The buildings with commercial space aren't collecting, probably, if commercial collections are at 25%, an owner might be lucky. There are people who've probably, there's certainly people who aren't paying their rent. And I'm assuming there are people who are behind or not paying their maintenance fees in a co-op or condo because they've been impacted by COVID-19 in some way, shape, or form. And what we're asking is the city to at least, we're not saying we don't want to pay any tax, but at least go back to the tax bill that people had last year or the year before, so they can at least plan and meet that obligation. Tax assessments came out January 15th. Everyone had till March 1st to file a challenge. I think there were 37,000 some challenges filed. Maybe they've heard 250 of them before the everything was shut down. So in effect, there's been no challenges heard whatsoever. On top of that, as I said, the commercial collections are way down, and people are struggling. So I'll let MaryAnn or Jay jump in there if they want to.
Let me start with you, Jay. Can you give me an idea, some kind of a snapshot of your members, where they stand today, financially speaking?
I mean, I can. So, April, we saw, rent collections drop about 10%, and we saw them drop about 15% on the residential side in May. On the commercial side, it's a bloodbath. We saw them drop anywhere from 60 to 70, in some cases 80 to 90%. So coupled together, as you know, in New York, many times you have a commercial footprint on the bottom floor and the residential and the subsequent floors above it. So the interplay between commercial rent collection and residential collection is important. And I think that's something many lawmakers are missing. I think the fact that the commercial rents and the residential rents taken as a whole are impacting our owners across the scale. Also, to Frank's point, there's been no relief whatsoever provided to many of our owners across the board. Those expenses, as we pointed out, property tax for multifamily home property owners is the largest expense. It outpaces mortgage costs in many cases, debt services, water and sewer costs. The property tax bill is the most, and it goes up every year, is the largest bill that they face on a monthly basis. So we're simply asking that we've done our part in many cases. We've provided direct relief to renters. We need to be more flexible in our ability to do that by having some sort of a property tax freeze. So we're just asking for that. And the mayor, frankly, has to step up and be a leader and figure out where he can cut costs to help make that happen. We're living in a delusional world where we're not going to be having a New York City or a state without some sort of a cost cut. Costs need to be cut. Our owners are having to work amongst the margins and reduce their budgets to make sure they're providing the best housing situations for their renters. And subsequently, the city and the state have to do the same thing.
And let me just ask you before I jump to MaryAnn, your owners have felt the effect today. Most owners do have some bit of reserves to cover for X number of months. If the sort of COVID world continues to the next quarterly tax payment, what do you envision happening if there is no relief?
I mean, it's speculation, but every owner is different. Some owners have a little bit more cash reserves than others, but no owner, and I think Frank and MaryAnn would probably agree, no owner has 6 months or a year's worth of reserves to operate. This idea that owners are simply banking all this rent money and that most of it isn't going right out the door when they receive it on a monthly basis. The number we use a lot is 70% of the rent, and in some cases it's even higher, of every person's rent check goes right back out the door in the form of fixed costs. So just using that simple math, it's impossible really to gather months and months of cash reserves. It's not feasible, and it's not actually how the long-term business model for rent stability, rent stabilized building and housing operates.
And MaryAnn, in the co-op and condo world, what has been the effect from your members?
Well, everything that Jay and Frank have described exists as problems in the world of co-ops and condos, but I think we are marginally better off because we are resident-owned housing. The people in the co-ops and condos of New York City are the owners. So when they can, I think owners in co-ops and condos do their best to pay their bills. But we, like rental properties, have lost the rents from commercial spaces because they were unable to function during the pandemic. We do have lots of owners within co-ops and condos who haven't been able to work for one reason or another during the pandemic, who are now 70 days into this isolation, contacting their boards, negotiating payment plans, requesting deferrals. So the burden there falls on the remaining shareholders and unit owners in the buildings to pay the operating costs for the buildings. We've had increased costs as far as maintaining quality of life in the building, keeping staff able to come into work, properly protected as they clean and protect our buildings. So the challenge there is to be able to pay our bills, and as has been suggested, as the months go by, it will become more and more problematic. But we surely do encourage anyone and everyone to pay their bills if they can, and most particularly to pay property taxes, because the city needs our taxes to function. But I think that we're making a very realistic proposal here in saying the values of our properties have doubtless gone down in these weeks of pandemic. Returning to the 2018-2019 tax assessment level is both realistic and more palatable to people than seeing bills at the new rates, the new assessment levels that I see published already on the Department of Finance website, and they all are increases in value.
I just want to ask, and I know this is a bit of a doomsday question. If the city does not respond to your request, rates go up, the next quarter's tax bills are due, could you just, and the city is slow to open up, and commercial doesn't, revive in a nanosecond, nor do people's jobs. What do you imagine the scenario might be for the city down the road if it doesn't take some action today to provide some help?
Well, I'll take a shot. First of all, for at least the rental building owners, their ability to keep up with increased costs was severely handcuffed. Actually, was stopped last June when they passed the newest set of rent laws. So as everything keeps going up, they have no ability. Their bottom line is shrinking, has been shrinking for a year. If they can't pay their taxes July 1, and I think the bills are probably going to go out next week is my guess, because the city always likes to, even though the city council hasn't set the new tax rate yet, what the city loves to do every year, and they figured this out about 10 or 15 years ago, is let's send the bills out at the old rate, even if the rate is projected to drop. We'll collect all that money for 5 months. We'll get the float on that money, the increased cost. And then if it turns out that once the tax fixing resolution is finalized by the city council, well, we've held on to all that extra money for 5 months and we got to play with it. And then we'll adjust it going forward. It's one of the little games they play with the whole tax rate versus tax assessment. But assuming any owners or co-op condo buildings can't meet their full obligation July 1, then there's a tax lien. Then there's interest and penalties tacked on to what they owe at the convenient, consumer-friendly rate of 19%. So that's, before we started recording, we were having a little chatting back and forth about how the de Blasio administration seems to be mirroring the Lindsay administration in almost every step of the way. So all of a sudden, you could find yourself, since you asked about doomsday, of a lot of buildings in tax arrears with enormous interest and penalties on them going forward. And then down the road, either the city is going to be foreclosing on those buildings, or those owners are going to be walking away at some point, or you're going to have third-party collection agents going after those buildings with enormous tax bills on them, which only digs the hole deeper as you go forward. Because when you have a 19% interest rate on what you owe, I mean, you're almost better off going to a loan shark on a street corner getting the money than dealing with the city.
But would you agree, though? I mean, the tax bill that needs to be paid July 1st may not be quite so impacted as the one coming up in the next quarter. I
don't know the answer to that. I think Jay alluded to the fact, or actually stated the fact earlier, that this is a big city, and sometimes people tend to think of Manhattan as the city, but when you get into Bronx, Brooklyn, parts of Queens, those buildings may not have the reserves they need to pay the July tax bill.
Jay, do you find that also for your?
Yeah, I think that's 100% correct. And more troubling is, we're speaking to owners, and Frank is, I'm sure, and maybe even on the co-op side, of folks who are getting calls almost daily from vulture hedge funds from other states who are asking if now is the time for them to come in and buy them out. They're looking to come in and buy out long-term institutional multifamily owners who have been parts of the fabric of New York City for years. They know these neighborhoods, they know these buildings. Their families have owned these buildings and maintained them well for their tenants. But they're running into situations where they just can't afford to keep the buildings anymore, keep them maintained, keep paying the property taxes on them. And the folks who are looking to benefit from them are huge funded vulture hedge funds because they think they can come in and swoop in and buy them at a discount, and they want to know, frankly, is this the bottom? Can I get a huge discount on a property? So that's not going to be good for tenants. The end result isn't going to be good for tenants. That's not going to be good for New York in the long run. And ultimately, we need a real solution that'll help keep the owners in those properties, help them maintain those properties, pay those bills, and keep the renters in well-maintained properties.
As we reach co-op and condo owners, we don't have vulture funds coming in, but for boards, particularly those that have had a lot of residents who have been impacted with employment, but particularly those buildings with commercial tenants, and particularly those co-op and condo corporations who may have relied heavily on that commercial income. Perhaps the first payment can be handled, whether it falls on getting a line of credit or doing an assessment, but a second payment, if the city hasn't picked back up, will be pretty devastating in the co-op condo community, just like it is in the rental community, I think.
Yeah, I would add to that too. As all this is going on, so owners are worried about, first thing you're worried about is your property taxes, then your mortgage, but there's still local law 11 work, which is enormously expensive on almost any building. Just the inspection alone is expensive. And then now it seems to be all the repairs are always in the $100,000 to $5 million range on a large building. That's a huge hit to buildings. And you have now all the new energy requirements are going to kick in 2024 for a lot of these buildings, which are going to be even more expensive. And one of the reasons that I think MaryAnn and I and others lobbied to push out some of the due dates on the energy requirements was that because we learned this lesson 8 or 9 years ago when the city decided to eliminate number 6 oil. We said, look, if someone's going to convert from number 6 oil either to 4 or 2 or to natural gas, especially co-ops and condos, you need to put together a budget plan. You need to prepare for that. You may have to refinance a mortgage. You need a few years to plan for things like this. Owners are going to need a few years to plan for all the new energy requirements that are going to be kicking in, especially co-op and condo buildings. Yet they may not have that ability because all their money, every last nickel they have, is going to taxes now.
Right.
Yep. Okay. I thank you very much. I hope the city hears your message.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Frank, MaryAnn. Take care, Carol.
Thank you.